Most people today think of shields as factory-made, mass-produced gear, but back in medieval times, if you wanted a shield, you made it. From scratch, no help from a blacksmith, no machines humming in the background, just you, your hands, and hopefully some know-how. Because if you got it wrong, it wasn't just a waste of time, it could cost you your life. And after learning what actually went into making a proper shield back then, you'll never look at a piece of wood the same way again. Everything started in the forest, not just any forest, and definitely not just any tree. Shield makers were downright picky when it came to wood, and for good reason. Choosing the wrong tree didn't just mean a weaker shield. This could mean a split board mid-battle and a sword finding your ribs. The go-to wood: linden, also known as basswood. This tree grows tall and straight, with wood that's light yet tough. It's kind of like nature's version of bubble wrap, if bubble wrap could actually stop a spear. Poplar came in at a close second, offering similar perks thanks to its tight grain and shock-absorbing qualities. But timing was everything. Trees weren't just chopped down on a whim. Medieval craftsmen waited for winter, when the sap had sunk back down into the roots. Less sap meant less moisture in the wood, and that meant less chance of cracking or warping while the shield was being made. A split shield in battle might as well be swinging a loaf of bread. Finding the right tree took a trained eye. You needed one with straight grain and minimal knots, because twisted or uneven grain could wreck the whole shield. And rather than sawing the wood into boards like we do today, they split the logs following the natural grain using iron wedges and mallets. Why? Because sawing cuts across the fibers, weakening the wood. Splitting kept those fibers intact, making for a stronger shield. Each strike had to be spot on. Remember, there was no "oops, let's return this to Home Depot" option. When split, the wood was still too wet to work with. It needed to be seasoned, dried slowly and evenly, a process that could take anywhere from several months to an entire year. Boards were stacked with little spacers between them, allowing air to flow while keeping them covered from rain. Think of it like drying pasta. But if the pasta was going to save your life someday, every single piece of wood was carefully inspected. If one board was weak, the whole shield could fail. It was better to be a perfectionist now than to end up choosing between two equally painful stab wounds later. Now, once the wood was dried and ready, the real work began, shaping it into something that could actually protect you in a fight. To do that, medieval craftsmen used tools that look downright primitive to us now, but they were perfect for the job. The main goal? Take those rough planks and turn them into flat, even surfaces that fit together cleanly while keeping the wood's strength intact. Enter the drawknife, a curved blade with a handle at each end that you pulled toward yourself, shaving off uneven spots. Using it was kind of like giving the wood a close shave, except if you slipped, you'd need more than just a band-aid. Then there was the adze. It looked like an axe, bent at a right angle. This tool let craftsmen carve with precision, swinging it just right to sculpt the board down to the perfect thickness. It took the focus of a surgeon and the guts of a gambler. Shield shapes weren't always the same. It changed a lot depending on the type of warfare of the time. Early on, round shields were the norm, about 3 feet across, good for defending from all angles. Think of them as the medieval version of one-size-fits-all. Not flashy, but they worked. As cavalry became more important, Norman kite shields started showing up long. Teardrop-shaped designs that protected a rider's left side, while still letting them move freely on horseback. To make either type, you usually needed more than one plank. Most shields used 3 or 4 boards glued side by side, and that meant one thing: the glue had to be perfect. The glue of choice: animal hide glue, made from boiling bones and hooves until you got a sticky, powerful adhesive. It was the Gorilla Glue of the Middle Ages, but here's the catch. It started setting within minutes, so there was no time to mess around. Get it right or start over. Clamping the boards together was done with whatever was lying around: heavy rocks, rope tourniquets twisted tight with wooden levers. Primitive, sure, but effective. Once the boards were stuck together, the shield surface had to be cleaned up before adding reinforcements. Medieval craftsmen used steel scrapers to smooth things out and erase tool marks. But smooth wood alone wouldn't survive combat. This is where reinforcements came in, the backbone of the shield. The edges of a shield took the most abuse. Think of its swords sliding along the surface, spears smacking into it, or the shield just being used to shove an enemy out of the way. The rim needed protection, and for most of Europe, that meant rawhide. Rawhide is untanned leather, still super tough, but flexible enough to wrap around curved edges. Craftsmen would soak it, stretch it around the edge, and nail it down with tiny iron nails. It was kind of like medieval duct tape. It's tough, practical, and got the job done. If you had access to a blacksmith or money, iron rim strips were even better. These were hammered into shape to match the shield's curve and nailed into place. They added weight but gave superior protection. Then there was the boss, the round, domed metal plate that sat in the center. This wasn't just for decoration. It protected your hand and helped deflect direct hits away from your body. Making one was no joke. It involved heating and hammering iron sheets hundreds of times until they took on that iconic dome shape without creating weak spots. It was a delicate balance of brute force and finesse. Bosses had to be perfectly centered. Off-center? Your shield would feel lopsided, making it harder to handle and possibly deadly in a fight. Most bosses had 4 to 6 attachment points evenly spaced around the base to keep them secure. Some shields had additional crossbars on the back to keep them from flexing too much during impact. These wooden reinforcements helped distribute force more evenly and keep the whole thing solid under pressure. Every detail mattered. A loose rivet, a misaligned joint, or a wobbly boss could mean disaster. Quality control wasn't optional, it was survival. But even all that craftsmanship could be wasted if the shield didn't have proper protection from the elements and from weapons. That's where the outer covering came in. Once the wooden core and reinforcements were locked in, the shield still wasn't ready for the battlefield. Wood alone just wouldn't cut it, literally.
Out an outer layer.
All that hard work could splinter under a blade or soak up rain like a sponge. So medieval shield makers wrapped their creations in tough materials that could handle impacts, resist weather, and even double as a canvas for bold decorations. Across most of Europe, linen was the covering of choice. Flax grew in abundance, and its fibers made strong, durable cloth. Shield makers preferred medium-weight linen with a tight weave, the kind that wouldn't rip the first time a blade kissed it. Cutting the fabric had to be done right the first time, because unlike hair, fabric doesn't grow back. One bad snip and you just wasted hours of preparation. To stick the linen to the wood, they used that same animal, hide glue. And just like before, timing was everything. The glue was heated in clay pots over fires, just enough to stay liquid, but not enough to burn. Too hot and it scorched. It's too cold and it wouldn't stick. The consistency had to be just right, thick enough to grip, thin enough to spread. While the glue was still steaming, craftsmen brushed it onto the shield and immediately pressed the linen into place. They worked fast, smoothing out air bubbles, flattening wrinkles, making sure everything bonded evenly before the glue cooled and hardened. Often they used multiple layers of fabric to increase durability. The result? A flexible, splinter-proof shell that absorbed shock and gave a smooth surface for painting. But for warriors expecting heavier combat, linen wasn't always enough. Rawhide once again came to the rescue. Soaked until it was soft and stretchy, it could be pulled tightly over the shield's face and nailed or glued down. As it dried, it shrank, pulling tight and hardening into a tough outer shell. But there was a catch. If it was too wet when applied, it shrank unevenly and warped the shield. If it was too dry, it cracked and became brittle. Shield makers had to read the leather like a baker reads dough, just the right feel, just the right time. For the elite, or well-funded, there was a premium option. Cuir bouilli, also called boiled leather. This wasn't just hot water and hope, it was a carefully timed process that transformed regular leather into something approaching armor. When done right, it created a surface almost as strong as thin metal. When done wrong, it left a warped mess. So yeah, it was a gamble, but one that paid off with extra protection and status. Wrapping the edges was a whole challenge on its own. Whether using linen, rawhide, or cuir bouilli, the material had to bend around the rim and fasten smoothly. Bulky seams could catch a sword or weaken under stress, so craftsmen trimmed and pressed every edge carefully. The center of the shield, where blows were most likely to land, often got extra layers. Some shield makers experimented with hybrid coverings, leather over the high-impact zones, linen elsewhere to save weight and materials. It was all about balance, durability, without turning the shield into a boat anchor. Once everything was glued and nailed, the waiting began. Drying times were no joke. Linen-covered shields needed at least 24 hours to fully bond. Rawhide took even longer, hardening over several days. But once cured, the shield could finally be painted, and that's where things got personal. Medieval shields weren't just tools, they were statements. That paint job wasn't just for flair. It told allies who you were, warned enemies what you stood for, and sometimes even claimed divine protection in the middle of chaos. Before painting, craftsmen had to prep the surface with gesso, a white primer made from chalk dust, glue, and water. Spread smoothly, it created the perfect surface for pigments to grab. But getting it smooth was a pain more difficult than convincing a teenager to clean their room. No bumps, no streaks, just a clean blank canvas ready for battle art. Colors weren't just about what looked good. They were symbols packed with meaning. Red meant bravery and a willingness to bleed. Gold stood for wealth and heavenly favor. Blue showed loyalty and trust. Black meant sorrow or unshakable resolve. Green hinted at hope and growth. Everyone from nobles to foot soldiers understood the visual language of shield colors. The paint itself, mix of pigment and egg tempera, fresh egg yolks, blended with water and powder colors. This paint dried fast and clung like a barnacle to shipwood. But it spoiled quickly, so shield painters made a fresh batch daily. Imagine making breakfast and doing fine art at the same time. That was the vibe. Red pigment came from rust, literally. Iron oxide ground into powder. Yellow came from clay. Blue was the most expensive, often made from lapis lazuli or other imported minerals that cost a small fortune. If your shield had blue on it, you were either rich, important, or both. Designs varied widely. In early medieval times, crosses dominated, reflecting the spread of Christianity. Some shields bore saint symbols or Bible scenes, hoping a little divine PR might turn the tide of battle. Later, heraldic animals took over: lions for courage, eagles for power, dragons for wisdom and protection. Geometric shapes were also common: chevrons, stripes, diamonds, especially for warriors without noble bloodlines or personalized coats of arms. These could be painted quickly and still stood out on the battlefield. Some shields included Latin text or personal mottos. These little details carried serious weight: a family's pride, a knight's creed, or a prayer for safety. And of course, all that paint wasn't just pretty. It formed a barrier that helped waterproof the shield and protect the fabric beneath. Artists applied multiple thin coats for better durability, instead of thick globs that might crack. Once the design was done, a sealant went on top, sometimes tree resin, sometimes more glue just to lock it all in. But even the most beautiful shield was useless without one critical component: a way to hold it. Medieval grip systems weren't an afterthought, they were engineered with real battlefield experience in mind. You needed something secure, balanced, and comfortable enough to hold while dodging arrows and swinging swords. The earliest grip style was the center grip, a single handle positioned right behind the metal boss. It turned the shield into a kind of weapon itself. You could punch with it, hook an opponent's blade, or bash someone with the rim. These grips were carved from strong hardwood and set perpendicular to the grain for extra strength. Attaching them was a precision job. You didn't want that handle flying off mid-fight. Builders used rivets, pegs, and careful measurements to keep it rock solid. Later on, arm strap systems came into play. These used multiple leather straps called an arms, spaced vertically along the back of the shield. One strap near the elbow took most of the weight. Others helped with control and stability. This system spread the load across the forearm, making it easier to carry a heavy shield for long stretches. Adjusting straps mid-fight? Yeah, not a great idea, so they had to be positioned and fastened just right from the beginning. Cowhide made tough, long-lasting straps, though in colder weather, deerhide might be used for its flexibility. Each strap had to be anchored securely. Shield makers stitched and riveted them in place, sometimes using patches for reinforcement. If a strap ripped out, it could leave you defenseless in the worst moment. Some makers added padding behind the straps or handle wool or linen cushions to absorb shock. And many wrapped the grips in leather to prevent blisters and improve grip. If you've ever tried swinging something heavy for 10 minutes straight, you'll understand how important that extra comfort really was. Different regions preferred different setups. Northern European warriors often kept the old-school center grips longer, while in the South, arm straps caught on more quickly. But no matter the grip, If you didn't understand how to use the shield, its limits, strengths, and how it fit into real combat, then all that craftsmanship meant nothing. A medieval shield wasn't just a big piece of wood strapped to your arm, it was a versatile, strategic tool. But like any tool, you had to know its strengths and its limits. Otherwise, you'd end up swinging it around like a dinner tray and hoping for the best. And in a real fight, that wasn't going to cut it. Properly used, shields offered excellent protection, especially against arrows. During archery-heavy battles, shields became lifelines. Well-made one could stop most arrows from hunting bows. The wooden core absorbed the impact, while the fabric or leather covering helped prevent the arrow from punching all the way through. You could almost picture the shield bearer grinning behind it as arrows thunked harmlessly into the surface, turning expensive projectiles into fancy firewood. But not all arrows were created equal. Bodkin points, those long, needle-like tips, were designed to punch through armor. They focused a ton of energy into a tiny point, making them more dangerous against weak spots in a shield. Broadhead arrows, with their wide cutting edges, caused bigger wounds, but spread out their impact, so they were less likely to penetrate deep. That said, getting hit by either was no picnic. Crossbows raised the stakes even more. Their bolts were faster, heavier, and hit harder than most arrows. A standard shield could stop many of them, especially if angled correctly, but repeated hits in the same spot. That would wear down even the best-made shield. It was like being attacked by angry hornets made of iron, small, fast, and determined to ruin your day. That's why positioning was everything. Shield bearers learned to angle their shields slightly to deflect incoming projectiles instead of absorbing them head-on. This simple technique allowed arrows and bolts to glance off instead of sticking. Think of the metal boss in the middle like a medieval airbag it didn't deploy. But it redirected thrusts away from your body when you needed it most. In close combat, swords became the primary concern. Slashing attacks often bounced harmlessly off a curved shield surface, especially if the shield had rawhide or leather coverings. Thrusts, however, were more dangerous. They focused the weapon's force on a single point, making them more likely to punch through weak spots or worn-down areas. Spears and lances posed their own set of problems. These weapons allowed an enemy to keep you at a distance while generating a ton of force. Taking a spear thrust straight in, bad idea. You could drive the tip right through the shield if you weren't careful. Shield users had to learn deflection techniques, redirecting the point away from their core rather than trying to absorb the full force. Weight played a big role too. Most medieval shields weighed somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds. That might not sound like much until you've held it steady through 10 minutes of non-stop battle. Arm fatigue was a real threat. Too heavy, and the shield slowed you down or left you exposed. It's too light, and it might not stop a thing. Warriors had to find the balance between protection and maneuverability, especially during fast retreats or chaotic charges. But shields weren't just for defense. They could go on the offensive too. A large shield could be used to bash opponents, knock them off balance, or create openings for a sword strike. The metal boss in the middle, that was more than just decoration. It was a blunt force weapon. Slammed into an unarmored face or chest, it could break bones and end fights quickly. Of course, not all weapons damaged shields the same way. Swords and axes cut or punctured, but maces and warhammers, they crushed. These blunt weapons delivered massive force, shattering wood and collapsing metal reinforcements. Even if they didn't break the shield immediately, repeated hits could weaken its structure, turning it into little more than an oversized paddle. That's why smart warriors learned how to position their shields during different types of attacks. Absorbing force when necessary, but always trying to avoid direct, repeated impacts. Think of a shield like medieval insurance. It covered most of the stuff that could go wrong. But there were always exceptions in the fine print. Weather added another layer of complexity. Rain could loosen joints or soften glue. Cold made leather straps brittle. Even the best shield had a shelf life. And once it started breaking down, repairs weren't optional. They were urgent. Sometimes damage was minor, like a tear in the linen covering. That could be patched with fresh fabric and glue, leaving visible scars that told stories of past battles. Leather damage could also be repaired, though it was trickier, kind of like darning socks, if the sock had been stabbed and your life depended on it. Cracked wood, though, was a bigger issue. Surface cracks could sometimes be sealed with glue and clamped until fixed. But glue joint failures where the entire plank separation started coming apart were like broken trust. Hard to fix, easy to prevent if you'd just done the job right the first time. Economics played a big role in repair decisions. Wealthy knights could just toss a broken shield and commission a new one. Common soldiers, on the other hand, had to stretch every piece of gear for as long as possible. Sometimes, creativity became the best tool in the toolbox. Badly damaged shields weren't always thrown out. Wooden cores might be repurposed into tool handles, furniture, or even construction material. The medieval equivalent of stripping down an old car for parts. Shields weren't just weapons, they were resources. Metal components, especially bosses and rim pieces, were valuable. Iron wasn't cheap, so even damaged parts were salvaged. They'd be reforged into nails, knives, tools, or new hardware. If the wood was beyond saving, it might be burned for fuel, powering forges or cooking fires. Some shields, especially those from famous battles, became trophies. Instead of being recycled, they were preserved and passed down. Hung in churches, castle halls, or family homes, they served as symbols of pride and heritage. A cracked shield might be worth more than a perfect one if it came with the right story. And across different regions of Europe, these shield recycling practices varied. But one thing was constant: nothing went to waste. If something could be reused, repurposed, or reforged, it was. Medieval shield making and breaking wasn't just about survival, it was about resourcefulness. From selecting the perfect tree in the cold of winter, to painting a family crest with egg yolk and powdered rust, every medieval shield was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, necessity, and culture. It wasn't just a tool, it was a story of skill, of war, of identity. A walking canvas that could stop an arrow, bash an enemy, and shout to the world exactly who you were. In a time when life could turn on the swing of a sword, your shield was more than defense. It was a partner, a declaration. And sometimes, the only thing standing between you and a very bad day.